Fear in cinema is often described as personal, subjective, dependent on taste, tolerance, or experience. But that explanation fails when the same films unsettle different audiences across decades, cultures, and viewing contexts. The response may feel emotional, but the cause is not. Fear is not discovered during a screening. It is designed before the camera ever rolls. Horror films do not work because of what they show. They work because of how information is restricted, delayed, framed, or removed. What the audience cannot see is often more important than what appears on screen. Silence carries more weight than dialogue. Stillness does more work than motion. These are not aesthetic choices. They are structural decisions. When a horror film succeeds, it is rarely accidental. The fear response emerges from controlled variables, camera placement that limits spatial certainty, sound design that withholds orientation, editing rhythms that resist resolution, and narrative structures that deny explanation. Each element narrows the viewer's sense of control while maintaining coherence. This episode is not about stories, symbolism, or themes. It is not a recommendation list, and it is not an emotional walkthrough. It is an examination of mechanics. Each film in this countdown is treated as a constructed system. Each entry isolates one primary technical decision, the specific choice that allows the film to function as horror. Not because it shocks, not because it disturbs, but because it manipulates perception with precision. These films work because they are engineered to. And once that design becomes visible, fear stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling intentional. 1. Rosemary's Baby. Primary fear mechanism. Incremental integration through social normalcy. The film constructs fear by embedding its system within ordinary social interaction. Ritual elements are introduced as favors, advice, or concern. The camera frames these exchanges neutrally, avoiding emphasis that would mark them as significant. This approach allows the system to integrate gradually. Each interaction appears reasonable in isolation. The audience recognizes accumulation only after alignment becomes visible. By then, the structure is already complete. The mechanism is effective because it replaces confrontation with consent. Participation occurs without explicit agreement. The film never requires a moment of acceptance. It relies on continuity of behavior. The trade-off is immediacy. The film avoids dramatic peaks, choosing progression over escalation. That restraint ensures coherence. Fear is not triggered by revelation, but by recognizing that the system has been operating uninterrupted from the beginning. 2. The Norless tapes. Primary fear mechanism. Documentary framing to deny narrative safety. The film adopts a pseudo-documentary format that restricts cinematic language. Camera movement is functional, lighting is neutral, and scenes are presented as records rather than dramatizations. This removes familiar cues that signal fiction. By limiting expressive tools, the film denies the audience narrative reassurance. Events are observed rather than shaped. The lack of emphasis prevents emotional guidance, forcing viewers to interpret material without cinematic mediation. The mechanism works by collapsing distance. When presentation resembles documentation, the viewer cannot rely on genre convention to establish boundaries. The material is processed as evidence rather than story. The trade-off is polish. The film relinquishes visual refinement and dramatic pacing. In return, it gains credibility. Fear here is not heightened through technique, but sustained through the refusal to aestheticize. 3. The Black Cat. Primary fear mechanism. Architectural symmetry as behavioral control. The film uses rigid architectural design to regulate perception. Interiors are composed with strong symmetry, fixed sightlines, and controlled depth. The camera reinforces this order by maintaining stable framing and minimizing disruptive movement. This visual discipline conditions the viewer to expect alignment and control. When characters move within these spaces, their behavior appears constrained by the environment itself. The setting does not react to them, it contains them. Ritual action, when it occurs, feels permitted rather than improvised. The mechanism is effective because spatial order replaces emotional signaling. The audience does not rely on performance or music to understand threat. The environment communicates authority through repetition and balance. The trade-off is flexibility. The film sacrifices expressive variation to preserve control. But that limitation strengthens the effect. Fear emerges from the sense that the space dictates behavior, not the characters who occupy it. 4. The omen, primary fear mechanism. Pattern recognition through distributed signs. The film relies on dispersed indicators rather than centralized events. Objects, information, and timing align across scenes without converging into a single explanatory moment. The camera treats each sign as incidental, avoiding emphasis or repetition within any one scene. This distribution encourages pattern recognition. The audience assembles meaning retrospectively, connecting elements across time, rather than processing them as they appear. Fear emerges from recognizing alignment rather than witnessing cause. The mechanism works because it delays comprehension without withholding information. Nothing is hidden. It is simply ungrouped. The viewer must perform synthesis independently, which increases cognitive investment. The trade-off is immediacy. Without focal points, tension develops gradually. The film accepts this pacing, allowing recognition to replace revelation as the primary driver of effect. 5. The sentinel, primary fear mechanism. Role-based continuity, replacing individual agency. The film constructs fear through the persistence of roles rather than actions. Specific positions must remain occupied, and the narrative emphasizes succession over choice. Characters enter functions already defined by the system they inherit. This mechanism shifts focus from event to maintenance. The camera observes spaces and routines with neutrality, reinforcing the idea that the system's survival does not depend on belief or intention, only on occupancy. Individual motivation becomes irrelevant. The effectiveness comes from deep personalization. When roles outlast participants, the viewer understands that resistance is not part of the system's design. The ritual continues because it is embedded in structure, not enforced through confrontation. The trade-off is character depth. The film reduces psychological exploration to preserve structural clarity. In doing so, it frames fear as an administrative process, one that persists through replacement rather than persuasion. 6. The Wicker Man, primary fear mechanism. Narrative inevitability through complete cultural framing. The film relies on a fully articulated cultural system that operates without interruption. Custom songs and social rituals are presented as coherent, mutually reinforcing practices rather than isolated events. The camera treats these behaviors as ordinary, never highlighting them as anomalous. This completeness removes friction. Because the belief system is shown functioning smoothly, the audience has no structural basis to question its legitimacy. The film does not argue for the culture's logic. It demonstrates it repeatedly until resistance feels conceptually misplaced. The effectiveness lies in inevitability. When every interaction conforms to the same internal rules, deviation becomes unthinkable. The viewer recognizes outcomes not because of foreshadowing, but because the system leaves no alternative paths. The trade-off is suspense volatility. By committing to consistency, the film reduces surprise. But that constraint is deliberate. Fear emerges not from shock, but from the realization that the structure is too complete to fail. 7. Alucarda, primary fear mechanism. Sensory overload through sustained intensity. Unlike films that rely on restraint, Alucarda applies continuous sensory pressure. The film minimizes contrast by maintaining high levels of visual and auditory intensity across extended sequences. Movement, sound, and performance remain elevated without relief. This sustained intensity prevents recalibration. Without quiet intervals, the viewer loses reference points that typically allow interpretation or distance. The experience becomes less about processing information and more about endurance. The mechanism is effective because it overwhelms analytical engagement. When intensity does not fluctuate, the audience cannot anticipate or categorize moments. Perception becomes reactive, guided by sensation rather than structure. The trade-off is precision. Continuous pressure reduces nuance and can fatigue the viewer. The film accepts this cost, prioritizing total immersion over clarity. Fear here is not constructed through mystery or delay, but through prolonged exposure that resists segmentation. 8. The possessed. Primary fear mechanism. Environmental saturation through slow visual accumulation. The film builds fear by saturating the environment with repeated visual and spatial cues rather than concentrating them in singular moments. Symbols, gestures, and spatial arrangements recur across scenes without escalation or commentary. This accumulation operates below conscious attention. Individual elements rarely demand focus, but their repetition across time establishes continuity. The viewer begins to recognize patterns without being told to interpret them, producing familiarity without explanation. The mechanism works because it avoids peaks. There is no central scene where meaning is delivered. Instead, understanding emerges gradually as the environment itself becomes structured. Space replaces event as the carrier of information. The limitation is immediacy. The film does not reward short-term attention and can feel inert. However, that inertia is strategic. By distributing meaning across duration, the film ensures that fear develops as a condition rather than a reaction. 9. Race with the devil. Primary fear mechanism. Sudden exposure without narrative preparation. The film relies on abrupt revelation introduced without preparatory framing. A ritual appears mid-flow, captured with minimal setup and no explanatory buffer. The camera arrives after the structure is already in motion, denying the audience contextual orientation. This choice removes the usual cues that signal importance. There is no build-up, no musical lead-in, no narrative permission to interpret. The scene is presented as incidental something stumbled upon rather than staged. That denial of preparation forces the viewer to process information reactively rather than analytically. The effectiveness lies in temporal asymmetry. By placing the audience behind the event rather than ahead of it, the film creates a perception of vulnerability. The ritual is not something the viewer watches unfold. It is something already underway, indifferent to observation. The trade-off is clarity. The film sacrifices explanatory cohesion and risks disorientation, but that cost is integral to the mechanism. By refusing narrative alignment, the scene asserts autonomy, reinforcing the idea that the system existed before and will continue after the camera's presence. 10. The seventh victim. Primary fear mechanism. Off-screen organization through implied structure. The film generates unease by suggesting a belief system that operates largely outside the frame. Meetings, rules, and enforcement are referenced more often than shown. The camera remains focused on consequence rather than ceremony. This off-screen emphasis creates a perception of scale without visualization. The audience understands that the system extends beyond what is visible, functioning continuously, regardless of observation. The lack of explicit ritual imagery shifts attention to behavioral control. The mechanism is effective because it removes spectacle. Fear emerges from implication rather than depiction. By limiting access to the system's inner workings, the film positions the viewer alongside characters who sense control without seeing its source. The trade-off is immediacy. Without visual reinforcement, the threat relies on inference. But that restraint strengthens the effect. The belief system feels larger precisely because it is not contained within the frame. 11. To the devil a daughter. Primary fear mechanism. Narrative withholding through delayed assembly. The film withholds key information by fragmenting ritual knowledge across scenes. Rather than presenting a complete ceremonial sequence, it distributes partial actions, symbols, and references without immediate context. No single moment explains the system in full. This approach forces the audience into an incremental assembly process. Understanding develops through accumulation rather than revelation. Each fragment appears incomplete but none are arbitrary. Over time, the viewer constructs the ritual internally, aligning interpretation with structure. The mechanism works because it transfers cognitive labor to the audience. Meaning is not delivered, it is assembled. This increases engagement while maintaining distance, as the film never confirms interpretation outright. The limitation is coherence. Withholding risks confusion or misalignment if fragments fail to connect. The film accepts this risk, prioritizing controlled incompleteness over clarity. The result is a system that feels learned rather than explained. 12. The devil rides out. Primary fear mechanism. Spatial rules enforced by camera discipline. The film relies on clearly defined spatial boundaries to control viewer perception. Protective circles, interior layouts, and positional hierarchies are filmed with consistent framing that reinforces their function. The camera rarely crosses these boundaries, once established, treating them as operational constraints rather than symbolic markers. This discipline teaches the audience how space works before asking them to react to it. By maintaining stable camera positions and avoiding disorienting angles, the film preserves spatial legibility. Viewers always understand where characters are in relation to the ritual structure and, more importantly, where they are not allowed to go. The effectiveness comes from constraint. When space is clearly regulated, any violation becomes perceptible without emphasis. The audience does not need warning signals. The visual grammar has already defined acceptable movement. The trade-off is dynamism. The film sacrifices visual experimentation and kinetic energy. But in return, it achieves authority. The ritual space feels governed by rules that the camera itself obeys, reinforcing the sense that the system exists independently of the narrative. 13. The believers. Primary fear mechanism. Procedural clarity. The film relies on procedural presentation rather than ambiguity. Ritual elements are shown with clarity, actions or complete sequences are ordered, and visual information is rarely obscured. This transparency removes the distancing effect of mystery. By presenting belief-driven practices as operational systems, the film reframes them as functional rather than symbolic. The camera emphasizes completion actions. Begin, proceed, and end without interruption. This completeness discourages speculative interpretation and replaces it with observational processing. The mechanism is effective because clarity invites comprehension. When the audience understands how a process works, attention shifts from disbelief to consequence. The ritual does not need to be explained emotionally. Its logic is demonstrated spatially and temporally. The trade-off is subtlety. By choosing clarity, the film reduces ambiguity. But this choice reinforces its central effect. Fear emerges not from confusion, but from recognizing that the system operates efficiently without requiring belief from the viewer. 14. The Mephisto waltz. Primary fear mechanism. Rhythmic structure through controlled pacing. The Mephisto waltz depends on pacing as an organizing principle. The film establishes a measured rhythm, long takes, restrained camera movement, and scenes that resolve without emphasis. This consistency creates a temporal pattern that governs viewer expectation. Instead of using cuts to heighten tension, the film limits them. Transitions are smooth, rarely abrupt. This removes spikes in sensory input and replaces them with continuity. The result is a viewing experience that feels cyclical rather than directional. The mechanism works by aligning the audience's sense of time with the film's internal rhythm. When scenes move at a uniform pace, deviations become noticeable without being announced. The viewer detects change, not through spectacle, but through disruption of pattern. The limitation is immediacy. The film forgoes urgency and risks emotional flatness. However, that restraint is essential to its effect. By maintaining rhythm, the film positions fear as a product of structure emerging when the established tempo subtly shifts. 15. The devil's reign. Primary fear mechanism. Repetition as normalization. The film relies on ritual repetition presented without narrative emphasis. Rather than escalating toward a payoff, The Devil's Reign allows ceremonial actions to recur with minimal variation. Movements, positions, and spoken elements return unchanged, framed in steady compositions that avoid dramatic punctuation. This repetition functions as a perceptual recalibration by withholding editorial cues that would mark these moments as climactic. The film trains the viewer to process ritual behavior as routine. The camera does not isolate symbols for interpretation. It maintains distance and duration. Over time, what might initially register as abnormal becomes structurally familiar. The effectiveness lies in this normalization. When repetition is unbroken, the audience stops anticipating interruption. Attention shifts from what will happen to how this continues. That shift reduces critical distance and increases cognitive compliance with the scene's internal logic. The trade-off is momentum. The film sacrifices narrative speed and variety. Scenes risk feeling static, but that constraint is deliberate. By choosing persistence over progression, the film turns ritual into a system rather than an event, one that operates whether or not the viewer remains engaged. This episode treats horror as a constructed system rather than an emotional experience. Each film demonstrates how fear can be produced through constraint, repetition, and controlled information rather than spectacle or shock. The differences between them are not matters of taste, but of design. Which technical choice stood out to you the most? Was it the restriction of space, the control of pacing, the use of off-screen organization, or the refusal to provide narrative reassurance? And which horror film, inside or outside this list, do you think deserves closer technical analysis based on how it manipulates perception? Share your thoughts below.